Let's read The Moustache together, the story by Robert Cormier. Let's back up first to take a look at the vocabulary and think about the essential question in this unit. When do you really know someone? You think you know your family really well, but do you know what your parents were like when they were children? Do you know what your grandparents were like when they were your age? Something to think about. So make sure you review the vocabulary, and you should have already done that in our prior lesson. And remember, key vocabulary is highlighted in yellow. There is other vocabulary at the bottom of the pages that will help you understand the story a little bit better. So before reading this, we need to talk about conflict. One of the main points you can't have a really interesting story without it. But conflict can be external, something that's going on outside of you, or internal, something where you are not sure what to do. You might have seen this in some cartoons. Like, I will say it again, Emperor's New Groove is one of my favorite movies. And there's a character in there, Kronk, and he's trying to figure out what to do. And he has these two little creatures on his shoulders, an angel and a devil. So the angel's telling him the good things to do, and the devil's telling him the bad things to do. That's his conflict inside of him, trying to decide what should he do. So as you're reading this story and different complications come up, think to yourself, is this an internal conflict, something that the character is trying to figure out? Or is it an external conflict, something that's happening outside of them? For example, here, in an external conflict, a character struggles against someone or something outside of himself or herself. The conflict might be with another character or a group of people, or even with a force of nature, such as a snowstorm. In an internal conflict, a character struggles within himself or herself to make a hard decision or to overcome opposing feelings or desires. For example, here, Mike is going to visit his grandmother, and his mother, before he leaves, has a few things to tell him. That hair, that mustache, this is a conflict. Now, is it external or internal? External. The mother is having some issues with the way he looks and telling him. Now, if Mike were looking in a mirror and, what should I do about my hair? That would be an internal conflict because he's just within himself trying to figure something out. So as you're reading, don't forget, make predictions. And I'll be doing that as I read the story here with you, stopping to talk about different things and showing you my thought process as I read the story. So let us move on to the story. And Robert Cormier likes to say, I take real people and put them in extraordinary situations. The Moustache. So let me get this. Oops, I went too far. Read to find out how the teenage narrator responds to conflict. At the last minute, Annie couldn't go. She was invaded by one of those 24-hour flu bugs that sent her to bed with a fever, moaning about the fact that she'd have to break her date with Handsome Harry Arnold that night. We call him Handsome Harry because he's actually handsome, but he's also a nice guy, cool, and he doesn't treat me like Annie's kid brother, which I am. but like a regular person. Anyway, I had to go to lawn rest alone that afternoon. But first of all, I had to stand inspection. Now, see here that this word stand inspection is in bold. That means you can go to the bottom and they give you a little bit more information about it. Standing inspection is like, you're in the military getting ready to be checked out. Is your uniform on properly? My mother lined me up against the wall. She stood there like a one-man firing squad, which felt kind of funny because she's not like a man at all. She's very feminine, and we have this great relationship. I feel as if she really likes me. I realize that sounds strange, but I know guys whose mothers love them and cook special stuff for them and worry about them and all, but there's something missing in their relationship. Anyway, she frowned and started the routine. That hair, she said, then admitted, well, at least you combed it. I sighed. I have discovered that it's better to sigh than argue. And that mustache. She shook her head. I still say a 17-year-old has no business wearing a mustache. What do you think? 17 years old? I've seen 14-year-olds with a mustache. It's an experiment, I said. I just wanted to see if I could grow one. To tell the truth, I had proved my point about being able to grow a decent mustache, but I also had learned to like it. So, right here we have this point to stop and look here on the side. What do you think Mike will do about his mustache? His mom doesn't really care for it, but he likes it. What would you do? Keep track of your prediction on your chart. So if you're writing things down, predictions, keep track of them. You can also keep track in your head. And that shows that you are planning as you're reading and monitoring. Because when you come to a point where, oh, I thought this was going to happen, but that happened instead. So monitor. Go back, think about those predictions. Did they work out or not? So back to what Mike had said, I also had learned to like it. It's costing you money, Mike, she said. I know. The money was a reference to the movies. The downtown cinema has a special Friday night offer. Half price admission for high school couples, 17 or younger. So he could go on a date and they could get in for half the price. But the woman in the box office took one look at my mustache and charged me full price. She didn't believe he was a high school student. Even when I showed her, I'm not getting the right, I'm reading from my iPad down here, and sometimes it will not, like right now, will not change the page. Sorry, need to pause this. Okay, and we're back. So she charged, even when she saw the driver's license, she still didn't believe him. She charged full admission for Cindy's ticket too, which left me practically broke and unable to take Cindy out for a hamburger with the crowd afterward. That didn't help matters because Cindy was getting impatient recently about things like the fact that I don't own my own car and have to concentrate on my studies if I want to win that college scholarship, for instance. Cindy wasn't exactly crazy about the mustache either. Now it was my mother's turn to sigh. Look, I said to cheer her up, I'm thinking about shaving it off, even though I wasn't. Another discovery. You can build a way of life on postponement. So, Given that this is what they've been talking about and this is what the story is called, what do you think the conflict's going to be about? Your grandmother probably won't even recognize you, she said. And I saw the shadow fall across her face. When we say that, a shadow, when something gets in between the light, a shadow, just like now, is on the face. But what it means is somebody looks a little bit sadder when a shadow falls across their face. Let me tell you what the visit to Lawn Rest was all about. My grandmother is 73 years old. She's a resident, which is supposed to be a better word than patient, at the Lawn Rest nursing home. She used to make the greatest turkey dressing in the world and was a nut about baseball and could even quote batting averages, for crying out loud. She always rooted for the losers. She was in love with the Mets until they started to win. Now she has arteriosclerosis, which the dictionary says is a chronic disease characterized by abnormal thickening of the walls. Sorry, my iPad went over. Now she has arteriosclerosis, which the dictionary says is a chronic disease characterized by abnormal thickening and hardening of the arterial walls, which really means that she can't live at home anymore, or even with us. And her memory has betrayed her body, has betrayed her as well as her body. She used to wander off and sometimes didn't recognize people. My mother visits her all the time, driving the 30 miles to Lawn Rest almost every day. Because Annie was home for a semester break from college, we decided to make a special Saturday visit. So arteriosclerosis is a medical term. Here we are down here. And Mike says the dictionary definition, but what about the meaning of the term did you get from the rest of the paragraph? And also, even though she has arteriosclerosis, that's not the only condition she has. She also has trouble with her memory. Now, Annie was in bed, groaning theatrically. She's a drama major. But I told my mother I'd go anyway. I hadn't seen my grandmother since she'd been admitted to Lawn Rest. Besides, the place is located on the Southwest Turnpike, which meant I could barrel along in my father's new Le Mans. Le Mans? I don't know. It's a type of a car. My ambition was to see the speedometer hit 75. Well, okay. Just a note here. Used to be you couldn't drive faster than 55. So it's 20 miles more than the speed limit. Ordinarily, I used the old station wagon, which can barely stagger up to 50. Frankly, I wasn't too crazy about visiting a nursing home. They reminded me of hospitals, and hospitals turned me off. I mean, the smell of ether makes me nauseous. And I feel faint at the sight of blood. And as I approached Lawn Rest, as I got closer, which is a terrible cemetery kind of a name if you think about it, which is a terrible cemetery name to begin with, and it does sound like somewhere where you would bury bodies. I was sorry I hadn't avoided the trip. Then I felt guilty about it. I'm loaded with guilt complexes, like driving like a madman after promising my father to be careful, like sitting in the parking lot looking at the nursing home with dread and thinking about how I'd rather be with Cindy. Then I thought of all the Christmas and birthday gifts my grandmother had given me, and I got out of my car, guilty as usual. So we're learning a lot about Mike's conflicts here. his feelings. He's giving you a lot of internal conflict. I'd rather be doing this, but this is what I'm going to do. I wish I could do this, but this is what I'm going to do. Inside, I was surprised by the lack of hospital smell. Although there was another odor, or maybe the absence of an odor, the air was antiseptic, sterile. The air, as if there were no atmosphere at all, or I'd caught a cold suddenly and couldn't taste or smell. So here's a picture that could be of Mike's grandmother. And, take a look at details to see what you think they could tell you. I mean, this woman's lying in the bed. She has all these things on the bed with her. Why? So, predict. What do you think will happen when Mike visits his grandmother? Think again about the name of the story. What do you want to bet that has something to do with this visit? A nurse at the reception desk gave me directions. My grandmother was in East 3. I made my way down the tiled corridor and was glad to see that the walls were painted with cheerful colors, like yellow and pink. A wheelchair suddenly shot around a corner, self-propelled by an old man, white-haired and toothless, who cackled merrily as he barely missed me. I jumped aside. Here I was, almost getting wiped out by a 2-mile-an-hour wheelchair after doing 75 on the Pike. Pike is an East Coast sort of a word for the highway or freeway. As I walked through the corridor seeking East 3, I couldn't help glancing into the rooms, and it was like some kind of wax museum. All these figures in various stances and attitudes, sitting in beds or chairs, standing at windows, as if they were frozen forever in these postures. To tell the truth, I began to hurry because I was getting depressed. So, another conflict. Is it internal or external? How can you tell? Again, he's the only one. He's taking it all in. But it is what is around him. So it is kind of an external conflict. Finally, I saw a beautiful girl approaching, dressed in white, a nurse or an attendant, and I was so happy to see someone young, someone walking and acting normally, that I gave her a wide smile and a big hello, and I must have looked like some kind of nut. Anyway, she looked right through me as if I were a window, which is about par for the course whenever I meet beautiful girls. I finally found the room and saw my grandmother in bed. My grandmother looks like Ethel Barrymore. I never knew who Ethel Barrymore was until I saw a terrific movie, None But the Lonely Heart, on TV, starring Ethel Barrymore and Cary Grant. Both my grandmother and Ethel Barrymore have these great craggy faces like the side of a mountain, and wonderful voices like syrup being poured slowly. So there, a face like a mountain? What does that mean to you? Doesn't mean that she has big things coming out of it, but think about it that most mountains are older. They're weathered. They go up and down, just like a person's wrinkles. She was propped up in bed, pillows puffed behind her. Her hair had been combed out and fell upon her shoulders, just like mine. For some reason, this flowing hair gave her an almost girlish appearance, despite its whiteness. She saw me and smiled. Her eyes lit up, and her eyebrows arched, and she reached out her hands to me in greeting. "Mike, Mike," she said. And I breathed a sigh of relief. This was one of her good days. My mother had warned me that she might not know who I was at first. I took her hands in mine. They were fragile. I could feel her bones, and it seemed as if they would break if I pressed too hard. Her skin was smooth, almost slippery, as if the years had worn away all the roughness, the way the wind wears away the surfaces of stones. "Mike, Mike, I didn't think you'd come," she said, so happy. And she was still Ethel Barrymore, that voice like a caress. "I've been waiting all this time." Before I could reply, she looked away, out the window. "See the birds? I've been watching them at the feeder. I love to see them come. Even the blue jays. The blue jays are like hawks. They take the food that the small birds should have. But the small birds, the chickadees, watch the blue jays and at least learn where the feeder is." So what do you think they're going to talk about now? She's happy he came. She's talking about what she sees in the window. So she's talking about the outside. Maybe the discussion's now going to come back to the inside. She lapsed into silence, and I looked out the window. There was no feeder, no birds. There was only the parking lot and the sun glinting on car windshields. She turned to me again, eyes bright, radiant, really. Or was it a medicine brightness? "Oh, Mike, you look so grand, so grand. Is that a new coat?" "Not really," I said. I'd been wearing my Uncle Jerry's old army fatigue jacket for months, practically living in it, my mother said. But she insisted that I wear my raincoat for this visit. It was about a year old, but looked new because I didn't wear it much. Nobody was wearing raincoats lately. "You always loved clothes, didn't you, Mike?" I was beginning to feel uneasy because she regarded me with such intensity. Those bright eyes. I wondered, are old people in places like this so lonesome, so abandoned, that they go wild when someone visits? Or was she so happy because she was suddenly lucid? She understood where she was, and everything was sharp and clear. My mother had described those moments when my grandmother suddenly emerged from the fog that so obscured her mind. I didn't know the answers, but it felt kind of spooky getting such an emotional welcome from her. "I remember the time you bought the new coat, the Chesterfield," she said, looking away again, as if watching the birds that weren't there. "That lovely coat with the velvet collar. Remember that? Black it was, stylish. Remember that, Mike? It was hard times, but you could never resist the glitter." I was about to protest. I'd never heard of a Chesterfield, for crying out loud. But I stopped. "Be patient with her," my mother had said. "Humor her. Be gentle." So why does Mike stop himself from expressing his confusion, telling her, "What Chesterfield? What are you talking about?" Some people, when they get older, they're not really living in the present. They're remembering things from the past. So here we've got some explanation at the bottom that a Chesterfield is a full-length wool overcoat named after a 19th century English nobleman, so from the 1800s. Not saying the coat was all the way from the 1800s, but it was an old-fashioned coat. So there hasn't been any mustache mentioned yet. You think this is still going to be about a mustache? What do you think will happen at the end of Mike's visit? We were interrupted by an attendant who pushed a wheeled cart into the room. "Time for juices, dear," the woman said. She was a standard 40 or 50-year-old. Sorry, I lost my page. She was a standard 40 or 50-year-old woman. Glasses, nothing hair, plump cheeks. Know anybody like that? Her manners were cheerful, but a businesslike kind of cheerfulness. I'd hate to be called dear by someone getting paid to do it. "Orange or grape or cranberry, dear? Cranberry is good for the bones, you know." My grandmother ignored the interruption. She didn't even bother to answer, having turned away at the woman's arrival, as if angry at her appearance. The woman looked at me and winked. A conspiratorial kind of wink. Felt kind of horrible. I didn't think people winked like that anymore. In fact, I hadn't seen a wink in years. "She doesn't care much for juices," the woman said, talking to me as if my grandmother weren't even there. "But she loves her coffee, with lots of cream and 2 lumps of sugar. But this is juice time, not coffee time." Addressing my grandmother again, she said, "Orange or grape or cranberry, dear?" "Tell her I want no juices, Mike," my grandmother commanded regally, her eyes still watching invisible birds. The woman smiled, patience like a label on her face. "That's all right, dear. I'll just leave some cranberry for you. Drink it at your leisure. It's good for the bones." She wheeled herself out of the room. My grandmother was still absorbed in the view. Somewhere, a toilet flushed. A wheelchair passed the doorway. Probably the same old driver fleeing a hit-run accident. The television set exploded with sound somewhere, soap opera voices filling the air. You can always tell soap opera voices. And I forgot to mention the fact that his grandmother behaved. Was that something that you expected? A way that she would act? I turned back to find my grandmother staring at me. Her hands cupped her face. Her index fingers curled around her cheeks like parentheses marks. "You know, Mike, looking back, I think you were right," she said, continuing our conversation as if there had been no interruption. "You always said, it's the things of the spirit that count, Meg, the spirit. And so you bought the baby grand piano, a baby grand in the middle of the Depression." A knock came on the door, and it was the delivery man. A knock came on the door, and it was the delivery man. It took 5 of them to get it into the house. She leaned back, closing her eyes. How I loved that piano, Mike. I was never that fine a player, but you loved to sit there in the parlor on Sunday evenings, Ellie on your lap, listening to me play and sing. She hummed a bit, a fragment of a melody I didn't recognize. Then she drifted into silence. Maybe she'd fallen asleep. My mother's name is Ellen, but everyone always calls her Ellie. Take my hand, Mike, my grandmother said suddenly. Then I remembered. My grandfather's name was Michael. I had been named for him. Oh, Mike, she said, pressing my hands. Oh, Mike, she said, pressing my hands with all her feeble strength. I thought I'd lost you forever. And here you are, back with me again. Her expression scared me. I didn't mean scared as if I were in danger, but scared because of what could happen to her when she realized the mistake she'd made. My mother always said I favored her side of the family. Thinking back to the pictures in the old family albums, I recalled my grandfather as tall and thin, like me. But the resemblance ended there. He was 35 when he died, almost 40 years ago. And he wore a mustache. I brought my hand to my face. I also wore a mustache now, of course. So what mistake do you think Mike's grandmother has made about him here? She thinks that Mike's her husband, not her grandson. I sit here these days, Mike, she said, voice a lullaby, her hand still holding mine. And I drift and dream. The days are fuzzy sometimes, merging together. Sometimes it's like I'm not here at all, but somewhere else altogether. And I always think of you, those years we had. Not enough years, Mike, not enough. Her voice was so sad, so mournful that I made sounds of sympathy. Not words exactly, but the kinds of soothings that mothers murmur to their children when they awaken from bad dreams. And I think of that terrible night, Mike, that terrible night. Have you ever really forgiven me for that night? Listen, I began. I wanted to say, Nana, this is Mike, your grandson, not Mike, your husband. So I wanted to say, so he's thinking this, he has not said it. Shh, shh, she whispered, placing a finger as long and cold as a candle against my lips. Don't say anything. I've waited so long for this moment, to be here with you. I wondered what I would say if suddenly you walked in that door, like other people have done. I've thought and thought about it, and I finally made up my mind. I'd ask you to forgive me. I was too proud to ask before. Her fingers tried to mask her face. But I'm not proud anymore, Mike. That great voice quivered and then grew strong again. I hate you to see me this way. You always said I was beautiful. I didn't believe it. The charity ball when we led the grand march and you said I was the most beautiful girl there. Nana, I said. I couldn't keep up the pretense any longer, adding one more burden to my load of guilt. Sorry, didn't realize that popped up. Adding one more burden to my load of guilt, leading her on this way, playing a pathetic game of make-believe with an old woman clinging to memories. She didn't seem to hear me. So why do you think he's so upset? It's grandmother's talking about forgiveness. When do we forgive someone? When they've done something wrong. So maybe Mike doesn't want to hear what his grandmother did, that she needed forgiveness for. She didn't seem to hear me. But that other night, Mike, the terrible one, the terrible accusations I made, even Ellie woke up and began to cry. I went to her and rocked her in my arms, and you came into the room and said I was wrong. You were whispering, an awful whisper, not wanting to upset Ellie, but wanting to make me see the truth. And I didn't answer you, Mike. I was too proud. I love this picture. If you look at this picture really closely, okay, it's not letting me. It's made up of different objects. Ordinary objects. You can see scissors in there, buttons, different things. But what I also like about it is it's fuzzy. It's not a sharp picture. So it makes you think that it's something from far away or long ago. I really like this picture. It was a good choice for the story. I've even forgotten the name of the girl. I sit here wondering now, was it Laura or Evelyn? I can't remember. Later, I learned that you were telling the truth all the time, that I'd been wrong. Her eyes were brighter than ever as she looked at me now, but tear bright, the tears gathering. It was never the same after that night, was it, Mike? The glitter had gone from you, from us, and then the accident. And I never had a chance to ask you to forgive me. My grandmother, my poor, poor grandmother. Old people aren't supposed to have those kinds of memories. You see their pictures in the family albums. And that's why they are. You see their pictures in the family albums, and that's what they are. Pictures. They're not supposed to come to life. You drive out in your father's Le Mans doing 75 on the pike, and all you're doing is visiting an old lady in a nursing home, a duty call, and you find out she's a person. She's somebody. She's my grandmother, all right, but she's also herself, like my own mother and father. They exist outside of their relationship to me. I was scared again. I wanted to get out of there. Mike, Mike, my grandmother said. Say it, Mike. I felt as if my cheeks would crack if I uttered a word. Say you forgive me, Mike. I've waited all these years. I was surprised at how strong her fingers were. Say, I forgive you, Meg. I said it. My voice sounded funny, as if I were talking in a huge tunnel. I forgive you, Meg. So, your predictions so far, have they been on track? Mike's the way Mike is acting with his grandmother. He's basically pretending to be his grandfather. Would you have done the same thing? Her eyes studied me. Her hands pressed mine. For the first time in my life, I saw love at work. Not movie love. Not Cindy's sparkling eyes when I tell her we're going to the beach on a Sunday afternoon. But love, like something alive and tender, asking nothing in return. She raised her face, and I knew what she wanted me to do. I bent and brushed my lips against her cheek. Her flesh was like a leaf in autumn, crisp and dry. She closed her eyes, and I stood up. The sun wasn't glinting on the cars any longer. Somebody had turned on another television set, and the voices were the show-off voices of the panel shows. At the same time, you could still hear the soap opera dialogue on the other television set. I waited a while. She seemed to be sleeping, her breathing serene and regular. I buttoned my raincoat. Suddenly, she opened her eyes again and looked at me. Her eyes were still bright, but they merely stared at me, without recognition or curiosity. Empty eyes. I smiled at her, but she didn't smile back. She made kind of a moaning sound and turned away on the bed, pulling the blankets around her. I counted to 25 and then to 50 and did it all over again. I cleared my throat and coughed tentatively. She didn't move. She didn't respond. I wanted to say, "Nana, it's me," but I didn't. I thought of saying, "Meg, it's me," but I couldn't. Finally, I left. Just like that. I didn't say goodbye or anything. I stalked through the corridors, looking neither to the right nor the left, and not caring whether that wild old man with the wheelchair ran me down or not. On the Southwest Turnpike, I did 75, no, 80 most of the way. I turned the radio up as loud as it could go. Rock music, anything to fill the air. Why do you think he needed all of that? He needed something to distract him. When I got home, my mother was vacuuming the living room rug. She shut off the cleaner, and the silence was deafening. "Well, how is your grandmother?" she asked. I told her she was fine. I told her a lot of things. I told how great Nana looked and how she seemed happy and called me Mike. I wanted to ask her, "Hey, Mom, you and Dad really love each other, don't you? I mean, there's nothing to forgive between you, is there?" But I didn't. Instead, I went upstairs, took out the electric razor Annie had given me for Christmas, and shaved off my mustache. So looking at these answers here at the end, think about them and write down your answers. You're going to be talking about these answers in the Flipgrid response. So what does Mike decide to do about his mustache? What causes him to make this decision? Remember to go back into the story and use details and examples. Also, how would you characterize Mike? How would you describe him? The adjectives you choose, give reasons and examples for it. And with a partner, so call somebody up, look at the conflicts here on this chart and think about the different conflicts that went on, what caused them, and were they internal or external conflicts? And finally, think about your predictions. What ones were logical and what ones didn't work out? You were actually surprised by what happened with the story. And again, as I said in the beginning, thinking about your own family, they were young like you once. What did Mike discover about people? Write down a paragraph about what if you were Mike, what would you do after this visit with your grandmother? Thanks for reading this together with me. Till the next story.